0, 1. Let's get started.
This week, La Mala Educación will focus on the failed exhibition by Ana Gallardo, an Argentine artist who, in her attempt to become the Antigone of the South, has launched her work by victimizing herself, or rather by representing a type of feminism that draws on victimization to claim solidarity. This is a clearly self-referential retrospective exhibit, though it doesn't declare itself as such, which took place or is still showing, I think until December, at the MUAC MUAC Museum in Mexico, a museum funded by public money as it depends on the university. Before diving into details about the exhibition and the scandal it provoked, which was less a scandal and more an embarrassment for the art institution, I should mention that this exhibit addresses the issue of the museum as a non-place, a neutralizing space that simultaneously monumentalizes the discourse of love and care for others, especially those vulnerable due to the old age. This discourse of love conceals a power dynamic where the artist positions themselves as the spokespeople for the helpless. This raises questions about the role of both the institution and art within it. Complaints from those supposedly cared for by this artist, Ana Gallardo, whose performative work claims to be to advocate for the vulnerable, put the institution in a very difficult position. I want you to subscribe to this channel. I know that it has little in English, but we will get there. And this is a favor I'm asking, so subscribe here. It's free and you can do it right below. Calling it complex or complicated doesn't capture the accusations of hypocrisy raised by groups closely connected to vulnerable communities. The artist's real hypocrisy lies in criticizing the institution as a strategy to build an alternative one, a kind of counter-institution that doesn't even see itself as such and doesn't bother hiding its arrogance in the attempt. This exhibit represents the latest desperate attempt by a form of feminism that views caring for the vulnerable as a public intervention and a political act. In Chile, for example, art historian Nelly Richard has recently aligned herself with this politics of care, suggesting that feminism's role in the new millennium should be understood as tending to those in need. However, this implies a return to the idea of women as a weak and servile gender. For caring for others to be considered political, it assumes continuity between femininity, hospitality, vulnerability, intersubjectivity, relationality, and activism. This doesn't necessarily place women back in the kitchen, but it does position them passively, which in the context of current biopolitics hinders their ability to engage effectively in broader political change. In this slide, I will analyze Gallardo's work as part of a larger trend in which white extractive attitudes are misinterpreted as feminist activism. Examples are, for example, Chilean artist Daniela Eltiz's Kiss to a Homeless, or her performance Zona de Dolor, or Chilean photographer Paz Errázuriz, and her body of work, Well, these break away from the insular, class-bound feminism of the Latin American elite who embraced second-wave feminism, represented, for example, by figures like the wealthy Maria Luisa Bamberg. They highlight something revealing. This peculiarity is clearer than ever in Gallardo's retrospective at the Mexican Museum. The apple of discord was a video that led to a monumental, supposedly political mural in Mexico, birthplace of political muralism. The video depicts Ana Gallardo's care for an elderly former prostitute from Mexico City. In 2011, she had already tried to collaborate with the hospice, but they rejected her, causing resentment to her and probably to the institution. In 2023, they finally allowed her to create the video and mural. Although asked to provide 70 hours of care, she completed only a few, just enough to film without permission, violating the privacy of this elderly woman and others. I wanted to work in the nursing home for former prostitutes, said the mural. There, very old women lived, old whores, very old. I contacted the director. I wanted to do a project with them, and they said yes, so I went there. The director didn't meet me when I arrived. I waited for many days. Daughter of a bitch. The bitch of the, it's the equivalent in English is cunt. This is the text that we're seeing. I'm translating it. I would go at the scheduled times, and she would stand me up, the director of the institution, arrive late and take care of other things instead of me.
Buenas tardes.
Then she would
Gracias.
that shit. When she finally resigned, she told me that first I had to work for them because I couldn't give them anything in return. I said yes, that I could cook. She didn't want me to cook. She wanted me to care for Estela, an old whore who was very sick. What a daughter of a bitch. How could she do this to me? I went to the old woman's room and she was lying there in a pile of soiled mattresses, in her own urine, which leaked from the diapers she had been wearing for days. The floor was sticky from so much filth. She was dirty and immobile, unable to do anything alone, just crying and crying. She cried all day, full of fury. She couldn't move, she couldn't do anything by herself. I had to feed her food that would escape through the holes in her teeth. I almost vomited. The motherfucker. I'm not capable of taking care of this woman. I can't. I vomited 3 times and fell on the street. I'm scared, but I returned to care for her. She's always full of flies that are born from her own shit. Cunts. I wash her hair and stroke her hands. What we see here, in Spanish, it sounds much more aggressive, I have to say. And what we see here is the self-dissolution of the empowered female artist, who, on one hand, presents herself as a romantic artist demanding privileged treatment, while on the other hand, justifies her artistic action by the ethical goals she pursues. She does this by assuming roles of manager, caregiver, and index, trying to highlight something we must recognize as an injustice and acting as an activist. However, it is precisely here that the idea that her intervention generates valuable debates clashed head-on with the artist's arrogance. First of all, the text we're analyzing lacks punctuation. Instead, punctuation is expressed through different fonts and insults. In the third line, Gallardo directly antagonizes the director of the hospice, placing her in the role of the institution. I would call this the Diogenes syndrome, where the romantic artist, by self-proclaiming as such, sees herself as stoic, resilient, and pure. In contrast, the director, being in charge of a public institution and holding what Gallardo presents as patriarchal power, represents the state which she perceives monolithically as the enemy. This view resembles, for example, the anarcho-capitalism of the current Argentinian president. In the fourth line of the mural, Gallardo claims that the director stood her up, as if it never occurred to her that the director had more important things to do than attend to her. This reflects a Manichaean view of vulnerability as a fiction, her against the others, with the director seen as a demon, and herself as a martyr. At this point, the problem seems to be demonization, but incels are a bit more than that. The incels in the mural. When she asks how she could do this to me, it reveals a deep indignation and a sense of tradition that goes beyond mere confrontation. This reaction reflects her frustration with the appearance of injustice and her struggle for recognition in a context that she feels is oppressive. The second part of the text is directly laughable. As Gallardo had agreed to be a volunteer to avoid interrupting the flow and intimacy of the daily work in a hospice, however, she mentions that the conditions are not what she expected, referring to resources more typical of European cities, or a privatized medical system, such as when she complains that the floors are sticky with excrement. But the worst part is the ending, where she quickly gives up and confesses that she can no longer care for this woman, to whom she doesn't even grant the dignity of a name. This shows a lack of conviction in her commitment to her own artistic aspect, which is not the elderly woman, but rather the indignity of the situation. The theme that Gallardo has always addressed in her career is the care of the elderly, and the artist alternates her own vomiting with gentle touches, creating a mishmash of sentimentality that serves only to justify her own discourse on affection, love, and care, which ultimately does nothing but monumentalize her. It is difficult not to relate this work in the hospice for elderly prostitutes to similar works that can be criticized for their analogous, even if metaphorical, extractivism in Latin American art, such as Zona de Dolor, Zone of Pain by Daniela El Tit, the Chilean, where she throws chloroform on the floor of a brothel, as if she had to clean it. Instead of working as just another prostitute, aligning herself with her own body, as Marina Abramovich did at the time, Paz Errázuri's, for example, photos are not self-portraits of the artist throwing chloroform like El did, but rather identify their subjects, who are transsexuals from a brothel on the outskirts of Santiago de Chile in the 1980s. They operate similarly, acting as a kind of, in the case of Paz Errázuri's, as a kind of lens that works as the hygienizing chloroform. In any case, they need to clean what they think is filthy. All of this has been read and glorified by the criticism of feminism feminist art and gender studies from the cancer generation through curators like Nelly Richard, Andrea Junta, etc., etc. In other words, from the 1980s and even before today, we can establish a genealogy in which feminist art is limited to stepping out of its white bubble, only to make a difference that is not aesthetic but social. And by doing so, the role of art is not emancipatory. Rather, it confirms the status quo. Black women, prostitutes, and lunatics, and poor, there. They remain there, while the privileged white stay here. Ana Gallardo confuses her work with political action, and in doing so, she establishes a very clear divide between the false careerist white feminists who do their dirty work of patriarchy, and then return to the kitchens of their apartments while women of color take care of cleaning up after their children. I met Gallardo on a flight from London, and at the time, my mother was dying, and I was going to do what she was going to do, what she now says she wants to do but clearly cannot carry out in Mexico. Gallardo has lived for over 20 years off the pain of others in a completely professional manner, glorifying it, which reflects poorly on her as a person. However, this does not necessarily question her art, even though it is defined by the intersections of ethical principles. So it's expected that you are a good person. The problem with this type of work is that it immunizes the viewer and acclimates them to a certain horror. The worst part is that she does this while blaming others, pointing at others in different directions without self-criticism, covering everything with the veneer of simulated affection and love. The exhibition was inaugurated with a performance that can also be seen as extractive, given that the museum acts as a kind of space for isolation and naturalization, as a non-site. This exerts a type of symbolic violence that becomes evident in the seconds before the Indigenous woman, chosen by the artist to inaugurate the show, prepares to speak. In that performance, this woman, Indigenous, an Indigenous person, tells us almost without punctuation, seemingly trying to piece together different stories into an indeterminate subject, representing the anonymous woman, the victim of femicides or of human trafficking, who is searching for her sister, who is presumed dead. She says, for example, that she was taken away and adds, I don't know where they took her. And yes, she left alone. She mentions someone named Inez, who disappeared in Mexico so that the owners of terror wouldn't find her, as well as Magdalena and her baby, who also disappeared. In the performance this woman did for the exhibition, this intertwines with elements and topographies like mountains and the wind. On one hand, the neo-stoicism of sorts of the Indigenous woman appeals to sentimentality through her music and a certain primitivism. On the other hand, it points to the relationship between women and the land, highlighting what is germinable and mysterious, the woman as fertile and mysterious. She says that they are still alive among the textile, those disappeared women, asserting that humanity's enemy made them disappear, that they were massacred and raped. However, she adds that they couldn't completely erase her because the fabrics remain, and their memory is still kept there. The fabrics she refers to are sashes and intimate garments. which also allude to old age and death in old age. This echoes a common theme in the history of Christian art, such as the Dormition of the Virgin, that here we can see in Caravaggio. The indigenous woman adds that Inés died from depression and anguish. So then mentions that the path in the mountain makes the mountain appear as a kind of screen onto which femininity is projected, symbolizing search and waiting as typically feminine actions and traits. She says, for example, I know they take shelter in the mountain, and I cry in the mountain. The anonymous lost transforms into the Virgin of Potosí, or La Guadalupana, into a virgin that is a mountain, which also carries indigenous and colonial connotations. Thus, this search and the topography acquire a gender identity in the discourse of women, being moralized and presented in contrast to the criminality represented by men. The conflict between art and state is once again raised, with the material woman against the stealthy and dematerialized and cunning man. Ego sum mountain. What is presented about the lives of indigenous people is clearly primitivist. If I'm not mistaken, the indigenous woman of the performance is part of a group of mothers or relatives of missing persons in Central America. This group travels with a microbus or bus funded by the Swedes or Norwegians, and as a form of activism to raise issues related to disappearances, many of which are self-induced. This is linked to the care of old age too. But in this context, I refer to the need to escape from ultra-conservative mothers who hold on to their children, female, according to their principles, which sometimes leads those children to disappear, but of their own accord, or even to be able to support them from afar, to support their mothers from afar. This aspect is not included in this lyrical comfort of mourning, which echoes the Ni Una Menos movement and the Madre de Plaza de Mayo in Ana Gallardo's presentation. Another element is the reference to the feminist projections of the second wave from the late 60s, such as the figure of the Grand Neolithic Mother. In contrast, in the presentation performance, the indigenous woman occupies all the spaces through a feminist and indigenous approach. It is lyrical, flashy, and Manichaean. At the end of the video, Ana Gallardo, the name of Ana Gallardo's name appears in large red letters, while the performer's name is very small. But let's remember that this is an exhibition that includes the mural, a series of videos, including the questioned video that I think that the museum removed after the scandal, the initial performance that inaugurates the show, as well as a presentation of objects and images, in addition to a curatorial text. I want to focus on these last two now. The layout of the exhibition is rectangular and divided by a large image of a portrait of a young mestiza. The young mestiza girl. The exhibited objects are of two types. On one hand, there are bourgeois paintings with still lifes framed in a modernist or 19th century style, positioned at eye level, which evokes a kind of white Western exhibition. In two cases, there are images on the reverse side. For example, one of the paintings, which presents a still life on its front, has a nude of the genital area on its back, as you can see now. This is combined with spectral enlargements that look like photocopies taped to the wall, not respecting human scale and echoing the framed bourgeois paintings in a spectral way. As I mentioned before, the large image of an adolescent divides the space in two and appears to float, while also serving as the wall on which a shelf with vases is placed. The other visible elements in the exhibition are precarious wooden pedestals with vases that, although they seem indigenous, are not, as their shapes are Greco-Roman and classical in their majority. In this work, Ana Gallardo draws a subtle reference to Ai Weiwei, but instead, the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei, but instead of breaking the vases, as the Chinese artist does, she preserves them, emphasizing their fragility and historical resonance. The vases serve as metaphors for classical femininity, recalling their use in ancient Greece for carrying water, and their shape is reminiscent of the female form. Particularly significant is the presence of a crater, an open vessel placed at the center of the exhibition containing another crater inside it. In Greek tradition, or in the Greek tradition, the crater or kylix was associated with the symposium, linking it to communal gatherings which give among men, which gives it a foundational but understated role in the installation. The addition of a lekythos, like a bottle, traditionally used in Greek funerary rituals, implies that these vessels transcend gender symbolism to become objects of mourning and memory. Funerary objects. Gallardo's use of these forms aligns the exhibition with the classical canon of Western art, even as she adopts an indigenous aesthetic that selectively engages with primitivism, as I said before, to enrich her narrative. As viewers move into the second half of the exhibition, leaving behind a large-scale portrait of the young woman, they encounter a mural that directly references an indigenous performance highlighted earlier. This mural, organized as a politically charged diptych, recalls the influence of artists Alora and Calzadilla from Lison Gallery. On the left side, there is an image of an empty forest clearing, while the right side features a line from the indigenous performer's speech that says, "I find a river, I think you're still here, you became water, a stream, a tiny stream, a riachuelo." This poetic statement forges a link between landscape, memory, and transformation, metamorphosis, turning the installation into a dialogue between nature, identity, and remembrance. Both the phrase and the mural, bearing the insult directed at the director of the retirement home for former sex workers, are presented without commas or capital letters. This stylistic choice renders the political statement both declarative and allegorical, yet grounded in a stark realism. Upon examining the curatorial text, it becomes clear that Ana Gallardo strives to encompass all spaces of discourse, but ultimately falls into contradiction. On one hand, she frames mourning as a public process, a significant thing in Latin America, but in doing so, turns it into a spectacle. She also highlights the unresolved wound of violence against women, advocating for remembrance. However, this open wound appears as a privilege reserved for those in positions of power, who act as intermediaries for subaltern and mestiza women who endure such violence. This dynamic exposes a bureaucratic administration of suffering, positioning the art world as an intermediary through figures like Andrea Junta in Argentina, Nelly Richard in Chile, or Ana Gallardo herself. Furthermore, the exhibition presents itself as a retrospective of an artistic practice aiming to heal and open up new possibilities. Yet the discourses underlying moral dichotomy often restricts identities rather than allowing them to evolve. In this context, victims are rendered as perpetual victims, and perpetrators are cast as absolute demons, leaving little space for complexity, nuance, or transformation. The exhibition adopts a Christian framework that demonizes men and casts the poor as objects of exploitation, portraying them as lacking resources within a context of extractivism. The text reveals Ana Gallardo's resentment and defiance, framing her as a heroine standing against patriarchal horror. Her militant stance against the supposed perpetrators of terror, whom she associates with men, positions her in a role celebrated, at least by her white peers. Ana Gallardo, through her own pain, leverages the suffering of other women searching for the disappeared loved ones. Her alta-focused work emphasizes an ongoing mourning for those lost prematurely, striving to keep their memory alive. Gallardo's text positions her art as a counter-pedagogy of cruelty, composed of three elements: memory, the materialization of absence, and the resistance to closure or forgetting. While she critiques identity-based strategies that glorify suffering, her approach paradoxically taps into what has been termed victimology, a concept she appears to mine as one might extract lithium, turning collective grief into a natural resource. The curatorial text highlights Ana Gallardo's commitment to a struggle reflected in her art and the solidarity it fosters, creating communities beyond family ties, This is quite queer. Yet, there is a sense that Gallardo, working in an environment that celebrates identity politics as inherently emancipatory and empowering, may overlook that art alone does not solve structural issues. These challenges, especially those involving race, social class, and other complexities, cannot be adequately addressed with performative gestures, applause, or gentle touches in a nursing home. Throughout her career, Gallardo has carried the unexamined optimism of a creative upper middle class into more delicate realities like poverty and old age. Today's world, particularly in Mexico, is increasingly aware of the nuanced difficulties of its context and less accepting of such oversimplifications. The real issue may be that leftist progressive intellectuals like Gallardo, Rangel, Junta, or Richard struggle to grasp the true scale of these complex matters. See you next week.
0, 1. Let's get started. rap beneath